Our loving God in heaven, we thank you that you so loved the world that you gave your only begotten Son. We realize we have a true representative of us in heaven. We are catching a glimpse of the ideal that you have for your people. And Lord, we want to know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ whom you have sent. As we study the messages of your prophets, the writings of Ellen White this morning, the restoration that you want to accomplish, and we look at the external events and what has happened and what is happening in the world today. Help us to bring the two together so that we may fully understand our role in this world and in the plan of salvation. So we ask for your Holy Spirit now to teach and to guide, to grant words and wisdom. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so I can sit because I'm not going to stand in front of the board. I'm going to bring up a screenshot of the board. There we go. We're continuing our study on China. The reason we're doing that is because it's part of our understanding of the King of the South. As we go through the history of China, there are three themes or threads that are interwoven. One is the relationship of China with Russia. The other is its relationship with the United States, the glorious land, and the connection of Taiwan to that in particular. And the other is its human rights record. So you'll see these three themes as we go through this history. So we started last time with the Chinese Revolution in 1949, Mao Zedong. They'd been fighting since 1927 in the Civil War. So the communists were fighting the Nationalist Party. The Nationalist Party were not saints. They were an authoritarian, corrupt party. But the communists won, and Mao Zedong created the People's Republic of China. And the Nationalist Party fled to Taiwan. The plan in going to Taiwan was ultimately to regroup and to take back the mainland. And that just never really happened. But that was the original intention. So back in 1949, you've got the problem of two Chinas. The China on the mainland, People's Republic of China, have always looked at Taiwan as a renegade province that it must reunify. And the Taiwanese government or the when the Nationalist Party fled to Taiwan, what they did was they pretty much set up the government that they had on the mainland. They just kept the organization they had on the mainland. They kept their connections with the provinces on mainland China and continued to run as if they were the legitimate government. So that went on for some years. And we haven't got it here, but in 1950, the PRC invaded Tibet. So we see Tibet come into the picture here in 1950. In 1959, we see the Sino-Soviet split. So leading right throughout the revolution, Stalin had backed the Communist Party, provided it with arms and support and anything they needed, and immediately recognized them in 1949 as the legitimate government. So the Soviet Union was very much behind the revolution in China. But we find a split 10 years later, and that's because there's been some ideological differences. There's a clash over ideology because after Stalin's death, Khrushchev wants to take the Soviet Union in a different direction. He's attempting to de-Stalinize Russia and to create a peaceful coexistence with the West. And China is still very much into Marxist-Leninist ideology, and we see this split between Russia and China here. Now, this is going to escalate. So we note that from 1949 to 1989, Russia and China are enemies. Also in 1959, we see the Tibetan uprising. So there's been nearly a decade of repression. And over these last few years, there's been a lot of murmurings. And in 1959, thousands start to rise up in protest. The Dalai Lama has attempted some peace agreements with Beijing that have come to nothing. And it's looking like the PLA, the army of China, are going to come and take the Dalai Lama away. So what happens is that 300,000 loyal Tibetans come to the Dalai Lama's palace or temple, surround it. They are not going to let China take away their leader. And they surround this palace, the Norbalinka Palace, to protect him. And what the PLA did in March of 1959 was they started shelling the palace. And hundreds of, tens of thousands of men, women, and children were killed. So in 1960, it was declared a genocide. And since then, 1.2 million Tibetans have died through Chinese oppression and repression. So that's 1 in every 6 Tibetans. So a really violent crackdown on the Tibetan uprising in 1959. Immediately, it is called a genocide by the world organizations, and sanctions are placed on China. Then we came to 1969. And 1969 is really a peak of aggression between Russia and China, and we see some short wars and skirmishes on their borders. Now, this is really quite important. This is a turning point, because this is where China starts to become more friendly with the United States, and the United States sees an opportunity to become more friendly with China. So if it wasn't for these wars, we probably wouldn't have seen the relationship develop at least as quickly with the United States as it did. Nixon saw this as an opportunity to befriend China. That the whole wars on the border were actually engineered by Mao Zedong. He was doing it on purpose because he saw that Russia was becoming weak because of their new policies. He saw them as weak, and he wanted to increase his reputation and make Russia look even weaker. So these wars were totally engineered by China against Russia. And now begins the relationship is going to develop between China and the United States. Which brings us to 1979. This is where the United States recognized China. It established formal diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China. And it acknowledged them as, it acknowledged their claim to one China. So remember, 1949, we've got 2 Chinas, and the PRC is saying, no, there's only one China. In 1979, the United States says, yes, we acknowledge your claim to one China, and they ceased diplomatic relations with Taiwan. So that was Jimmy Carter, but not all American politicians were happy with that. And so Congress passed the Taiwan Relations Act. The Taiwan Relations Act is where the United States essentially committed themselves to protect Taiwan, and it established trade and military ties. So it didn't it didn't exactly say that we will come in and fight for you, but it said that we would aid you if you needed help. So China wasn't really happy with the statement that the United States made over One China, and it certainly wasn't happy with the Taiwan Relations Act. So they've come closer together, but there's still a lot of distrust, and that will never go away. Now, 1979 is also when China begins its economic reforms. So under Mao Zedong, if you're familiar with any of that history, it's quite horrific. Millions and millions of people starved because of just bad economic decisions. So once Mao Zedong died, the government knew that it would have to change the way it was running the economy, and it brought in these economic reforms. They broke from the Soviet-style economic policies, and they shifted to free market principles. They wanted to open up trade and investment in the West and with the West. And this increased their economic growth and raised their living standards. It became the fastest growing economy in the free world. So I'll bring this back up again. And I have some statistics, I think. From 1979 to 2018, China's annual real gross domestic product averaged 9.5%. This has meant that on average, China has been able to double the size of its economy in real terms every 8 years. It is the fastest growth of an economy in known history, and they marked that turn from 1979. And then we went on to look at the one-child policy. So the one-child policy was the biggest social engineering project in human history. I'll just read, there was a paper written on this in 2019 by Li and Yang, and I'll read a portion of it. While some scholars have argued the obvious advantages of the reforms on women's education and empowerment, there are others who argue that although women acquired more and more skills to compete with men in the workforce, the gender discrimination increased in the market at the same time. As post-reform China saw a revival of patriarchal tradition, beliefs in gender essentialism, emphasis on biological differences, and relegating women's status as inferior labourers saw a comeback. So I've gone to that quote a bit early, but so the one-child policy, it placed women's reproductive autonomy at its heart. So they did have birth control initiatives before 1979, and they were state-led. They provided abortions, etc. But in 1979, this is when they started to, when they fully introduced the one-child policy. They had been trying to encourage less children prior to that, but that wasn't working. I think in 1978, they lowered the marriage age. Sorry, no, they lifted. No, you couldn't get married until you were 22 for a male and 20 for a female. Again, you notice the age disparity there, which goes with the patriarchy. But they had tried several ways of trying to get their population down, and in the end, they just enforced it. We're going to talk a bit more about that in a minute, but this is just a quick review. So people thought that this would be a good thing for women because they would have less competition, that there would be advantages for them with education, that it would empower them. In fact, what was seen from that time is more of a revival of patriarchal traditions, and women became more and more inferior. What the consequences of the one-child policy was abandonment of children, of babies, adoptions, female infanticide, where they were just murdered, and missing girls, where nobody really knows what happened to them, just assumed dead. And what we did was we jumped from 1979 to 2021 when the one-child policy was abolished. And so people thought, well, this will be good. This will be better for women. In fact, it's found to be worse. The pressure is now on women, young women, to forsake education, to be married and have children by the time they're 30. And if they are mid-20s and childless or unmarried, there's a name for them. They're called leftover women. So a lot of pressure. And we'll talk about that a bit more. Yes, escaping the government's pressure is just a reality in women's lives. It's just impossible. We'll come back to that. Then 1989. 1989 is the 30-year anniversary of occupation for Tibet. Unrest has been growing. There's demonstrations and riots, a brutal crackdown, and martial law is imposed. Now, why was martial law imposed? What was China worried about? I'm reading a New York Times article, says some China specialists say Beijing's decision to impose martial law in Lhasa, itself a highly unusual step, was in part motivated by a series of recent threats to the communists' control. These include inflation, widespread official corruption, and signs of local independence. The party's great fear is that the perception that it is losing control will lead to student protests and then worker protests, and then the whole country will be out of control, said a professor of history at Boston University. So what is China worried about? That they are losing control. So when this demonstration started in Lhasa, they sent the PLA, and it was a violent crackdown on the protests, and they brought in martial law. And they thought that this would calm the people down in China because there's growing unrest in the rest of China. They thought that this would be a good example. It didn't work out that way. So this is early 1989, in January. And then we see the first Sino-Soviet summit. This is talks between, it was a 4-day Sino-Soviet summit in May. Now, I'm actually going to go back and talk about Hu Yaobang first, because Hu Yaobang was he had high positions in the government. He was a progressive. He was trying to bring about reforms and rid corruption and give more transparency to the government and increase media freedoms. and he dies in April. And people that have been hoping for change in China are now very disappointed because of this man's death. So we know it's 1989. We know that the Soviet Union is on the brink of collapse, and that what is leading to that collapse is the reforms that have been brought into Russia. You've heard of glasnost. Glasnost, it's a Russian word meaning publicity. It's open and transparent government. So Russia had brought in glasnost, which is open and transparent government. The other word is perestroika, which means restructuring. So there are people within China that want open and transparent government. They want their own glasnost and they want their own perestroika. They don't necessarily want to overtake the government. They don't want revolution, but they want reform, a restructuring. And with the death of this man, that their hopes are shattered, especially when the government don't honour him in his death. So a day before his funeral, 100,000 protesters come into Tiananmen Square to commemorate his death. So that's April. But in May, they've got this 4-day Sino-Soviet summit. And Mikhail Gorbachev, which is the General Secretary of the Communist Party, is meeting with Zhao Ziyang. And it's a bit embarrassing because, you know, you can't take your visitors to see Tiananmen Square, the particular places that you'd like to show your visitors. They can't get around the streets because of the protests. But they have this summit anyway, and it was hailed as the natural restoration of party-to-party relations. So it was the first meeting between the two countries since 1959. It marked the beginning of normalization of relations. That's what both sides agreed to. Although nothing was normal in Beijing because of all the protests. Okay, the itinerary had to be repeatedly adjusted to avoid 150,000 student protesters. But they came, but the summit was considered a success anyway. So then what the government did was it called in the army from Tibet, said, come back to Beijing, we're going to stop these riots. And the army got to the borders of the city and couldn't go any further. They couldn't get through the streets because there were so many people. And it was really peaceful. Like the army would be there in their tanks and all the soldiers were there, and the people would come out and feed them and talk to them and explain to them why they were protesting, and it was all rather peaceful. Until about June 3. It took the army 3 weeks, I think, to actually get into Tiananmen Square. And on June 3, it is given orders to just plough through the crowds. And it did. Most of the people that died weren't in Tiananmen Square. They were in the streets surrounding. It was the army getting into Tiananmen Square. So, you know, everybody that died was innocent, but even a lot of people died that weren't actually involved in the protests. So when they got into Tiananmen Square, you've got all the leaders and the main groups are cornered in Tiananmen Square. And they're just told, you can leave now, or you know what's going to happen to you. So they decided there was no point in staying. It wasn't going to achieve anything, and they left Tiananmen Square. So I think that's a really important thing to understand, is that what China was doing was terrorizing its own people, putting fear into them to be submissive, to subject to the government. And it worked. This is the beginning. It marked the beginning of what is known as the endless purge. The endless purge, or the clearing and sorting out work, as it's known in Chinese. Gets translated to the endless purge. So this is where we finished, and I just want to re-explain. The endless purge isn't about killing people, although people did die, people were executed, people were locked away forever, people were tortured, yes. But what it was everybody that was in any way connected to that protest was forced to confess that they had mistaken understanding, that the government was right, that the government made the right decisions, that they were wrong, and they had to fill in forms. It was all legal. You had to rejoin the party, and there was no, you had to rejoin the party. So this is a purge that has continued from 1989 to our day, where basically you cannot talk about Tiananmen Square. You cannot talk about politics. You cannot complain. You cannot discuss politics at all. And as a result of Tiananmen Square, what the government did was it did bring in some reforms. It did apply some of the demands that the protesters were making. And so it's like society entered into an agreement with the government. You provide what we want and we will be quiet. And so the whole Tiananmen Square massacre has been wiped from the consciousness of the Chinese people. It's not talked about. It's not remembered or commemorated in any way. If you had, say, you were involved, or you had a relative, maybe your only child died in Tiananmen Square, come June of every year, you'd be shipped away on holiday, because they did not want anybody making any form of commemoration, remembrance of the day. So you weren't even allowed to mourn the day if you lost somebody. So this was strictly enforced. This is the turning point in Chinese history where lying to protect yourself or saying nothing to protect yourself is really the mantra of the people. You couldn't preserve or commemorate the protest in any way. Which brings us to, so that brings us to the time of the end. Now we're going to look at 1991. And in 1991, what the Chinese government did was it opened up their orphanages for international adoptions. And so the one-child policy has been in effect since 1979, and the orphanages are filling. So let's have a look and try and understand how this one-child policy actually looked like, what it looked like on the ground. Okay, first of all, what drove a country, the largest country in the world, to such a radical, invasive policy? Why did it do that? So after World War II, there's a population growth, explosion right across the world. And it's largely due to advances in medicine, nutrition, vaccinations. And many saw this as a welcome boom. They thought, oh, this is good. This is great. Population is growing. Societies is improving, developing. But there were others that saw a darker side of that. They had an apocalyptic vision of population growth. There were fears of overpopulation, and it began to worm its way into international discourse. Western academics unleashed a tidal wave of gloom and doom literature, prophesying of a crowded, catastrophic future in which millions of people across the world would die as a result of overpopulation. There was a bestseller written by a Stanford professor in the 60s about how hundreds of millions of people would starve to death. So you've got some people seeing the benefits of population growth and others thinking the worst. And this hysteria was imbibed by the Chinese officials. They thought that what stood between China and economic prosperity was population. We don't have enough food. We don't have enough resources for our population. A lot of people had starved during Mao Zedong era. So they really thought that if we could bring the population down, we would be able to grow economically. They wanted to prevent the births of hundreds of millions of people. And they did. They're very, very proud of their accomplishment. They say, we prevented 400 million people being born. There were a few that spoke out. There was one economist, Chinese economist, who spoke out. And it wasn't difficult math. He said it's simple. It's 1, 2, wait a minute, maybe I'll draw it like this. 1, 2, 4. So who's the 1, 2, 4? You, your parents,
child,
your grandparents. Yeah. And you need, one person needs to be able to support their parents and then their grandparents, because that's how patriarchal society worked. And if you expand that over time to millions of people, we're going to end up in a huge mess. It's simple, 1, 2, 4. And they didn't listen to him. So everything that he prophesied of pretty much came true. So out of this population explosion hysteria, that's when the government used propaganda to try and get people to stop having so many children. Didn't work. And we saw the one-child policy come in 1979. So if you wanted to have a child, you couldn't just have a baby. What you had to do is you had to go down, you had to take all your papers, all your proofs of identity, any paperwork that you had about yourself, and you took it down to your local office. You had to get a birth permission paper, and you had to obtain that before you got pregnant. So, or at least before you started to show. And then you went down to the local family planning office. You would wait all day in line and maybe be told to come back tomorrow, and maybe wait all day in line again until you could hand in all your papers and request to have a baby. And you would receive what was essentially a license to breed. So you had to get your paperwork first. It was difficult, it was intrusive, it was inconvenient, but that's what you had to do if you wanted a baby. And you can imagine that it's just a bit too hard for a lot of people, that children were born out of plan. So you were either born as a planned child or you were born out of plan. So because it's so hard, they had to radically enforce it, which meant huge fines. So something like 5 or 10 times your annual income, you'd be fined and be expected to pay. They might come and destroy the roof of your house. They might come and take all your grain, your stores of food away. They were really enforced hard this one child policy. In fact, it had its own. It employed people. So villages would have people employed by the family planning office, and they'd be keeping an eye out on you and to see who was having babies, if they were in plan, if they weren't. And you got kickbacks. You got extra money. You got paid to do that, but you got extra money for reporting people. So you had all that going on within the communities. If your out of plan children would be taken off you, they would be sent to orphanages, and a lot of people just infanticide, killed their children. They'd bring them to full term, or they'd have backyard abortions. And if you went through the whole demeaning process of getting a planning permit, then you'd want to make sure that that child was the child you wanted, and in a patriarchal society, that was a male child. So there was, this is when ultrasounds were starting to be used. So there were a lot of abortions based on gender. On top of that, there were forced sterilizations. In 1983, China sterilized upwards of 20 million people. There were vasectomies given, but there was always that fear that it would demasculinize men, and they didn't want to do that. But there were vasectomies. But the most of what they did was forced sterilizations of the women. The vasectomies, sterilization of men was usually done in poor villages. Women were given IUDs that could not be removed. So they were lifetime IUDs. The procedures were painful, irreversible. In 2010, 10 million people were sterilized in a city in southern China. So it's vast. And so you got neighbors spying on neighbors to see, you know, if somebody's having a baby, or if they hear an extra cry that they didn't, you know, hadn't heard before. There were systems of quotas and bonuses all incorporated into the family planning system. The more illegal women you uncovered, sterilized, or coerced into an abortion, the higher your paycheck. So over the next decades, China would ultimately carry out 336 million compulsory abortions. And many people would go to extraordinary lengths to keep their out-of-plan babies, but so many ended up in orphanages, etc. So that brings us to 1991. You've got full orphanages, and you've got, this is getting leaked out into the Western world. And people in the West are thinking, especially in the United States, are thinking, oh, I'd love a baby. I'd save one of those little girls. And so 1991, China opens up their orphanages to the United States. And there are other countries in the world, but it's primarily the United States that takes these children. And there's gold in them, their hills. So China sees this as a real revenue, money-making opportunity. And it's going to cost American couples thousands of dollars and years to be able to get a baby. But they persevere, and try and find some statistics. The demand for these babies was staggering. Over the next 2 decades, over 100,000 children were adopted from China, and approximately 80,000 of them went to the US. So in 1991, China first allowed adoptions to the United States. 61 children were issued immigrant visas in 1991. Over the next 2 decades, 80,000 would go to the US, 100,000 across the world. Which means money for the government, but also a black market. So now you're going to see children getting stolen, orphanages making extra money, getting extra children. There's a real black market in trafficking of infants. So 97.5% of Chinese abortions, whether they were coerced or otherwise, were female fetuses. And as far as the orphans go, it kind of wavered between 95 and 98% of the orphans that were sent overseas were female as well. So the Chinese government saw this as a win-win. They charged huge processing fees. They were making money. An orphanage would charge just a $5,000 US donation just to even get the ball rolling. So you can imagine that that was very lucrative. In 2005, 6 orphanages were found to be trafficking babies like cattle, with little regard to how they were obtained. So this is the thing, is they were taking legitimate babies. They were taking any babies. 2003, a bus was pulled over for a traffic violation. They found 28 babies in the back stuffed in nylon, and one had suffocated to death. The people involved with that were charged and executed, but it just gives you an idea of what was going on behind the scenes. In 2009, some family planning officials were found to have kidnapped out-of-plan babies and sold them to orphanages for hefty finder's fees. So what was happening in the States and across the world is people were starting to realise, does my baby have parents that are still looking for it? You know, was my baby really in need of this family? So it's caused anxiety. I mean, shocking anxiety for the family that's lost their child, but also for the families that adopted. Thousands of children vanished into the pitiless machinery of the underground black market, but millions more became legally invisible. So what happens to the out-of-plan babies that actually get kept? Because you couldn't take all the out-of-plan babies. Under the Chinese birth planning laws, after you had your baby, you had to apply for a document called a huquo. So you had to have your papers to have the baby. Then once you have the baby, that baby gets another paper. And it's not like a birth certificate. It's different to a birth certificate. It's actually your Chinese citizenship document. And if you're an out-of-plan baby, it's virtually impossible to get one. Without a huquo, you can't work, you can't get married, you can't get a doctor, you can't even go to school. China's household registration system, the huquo, so it's called a household registration system, is the country's fundamental citizenship institution. So recent estimates are that there are at least 13 million people, or 1% of the total population, that live without a huquo. Okay, they have no formal registration. They are non-citizens in their own country. Without a huquo, you lack basic legal rights with your government services. You can't get social welfare, you can't get an education, health insurance. You have no legal identity. You can't get a train ticket because you haven't got an ID, because you don't legally exist. So just think about it. You're in a family, one child's planned, another child's not planned. One child gets an education, gets married, travels, goes on holidays. The other child is in a cage without bars. There's over 13 million of them in China at the moment without a huquo. So one-child policy. We talked about the gender ratio, how it's so skewed, and how there's, I think, 30 million more males than females. There just isn't enough women to be married. So there's an increase in trafficking of women. They're bringing them in from other countries, from Cambodia, from North Korea, and yeah, just other East Asian countries, because it doesn't matter what nationality they are. It will go through the patriarchal male side. And also think about our 1, 2, 4, they have a huge, rapidly aging population. So they've really created for themselves quite a mess, as was prophesied by that economist. So what they're doing is they're trying to ramp up population growth, which means they're encouraging women to have any more children. So that was 2021. In 2016, it went to a two-child policy. It didn't do anything. Population birth rates still declined. The women don't want to get married and have children. So it just hasn't changed around, and now they're starting to enforce things the other way, but it's social pressures. So just to understand this, where this thinking comes from, because we're not talking about a Christian country. In fact, we're talking about a country that doesn't really have any religions. They have philosophies. There are 6 major philosophies in China. And the major one is one I'm sure we've all heard, Confucianism. And Confucius lived in a time when there was a lot of upheaval in the world. So this is like 300 to 400 BC. He's watching some of the worst history in the world. And he develops this philosophy that people are innately good, but they need to know their roles. And if they just know their role and they stick to their role, and they submit to those above them, it'll bring peace and prosperity. So that was Confucius' philosophy, which is, he listed 5 key relations under which all social interaction falls: the ruler to the subject, the parent to the child, the husband to the wife, the older brother to the younger brother, and the friend to the friend. So even within friends, there must be one friend that is above the other friend. Even within friendship, a hierarchy must exist to ensure continuous harmony. So dominant parties should treat the submissive parties with kindness and gentleness, and submissive parties should treat the dominant with reverence and respect. Isn't that what we heard this morning? Would be a blessing if they just followed the law. So this is basically what Confucius is saying. And it's this reverence of the patriarchal system that is going to keep this, that is going to bring about this terrible human rights violation on women and girls in the results of the one-child policy. So any questions or thoughts so far?
Not really a question, just a comment. When you pointed out, isn't that what we've been watching? I was just thinking the same thing, obviously, because it was so obvious that how much of our thinking has been along those lines in the past. Like what's the picture of beautiful headship? That's Confucianism.
Yeah, we'd have a peaceful, happy society. So the thing is, it's not the only philosophy that rules China, and we'll talk a bit about the other philosophies when we look at Xi Jinping, but it is the one that really solidifies patriarchy in their culture. Because we know it all comes from the Tower of Babel. There's nothing new under the sun. How are we going for time?
I believe, Elder Terrie, that I remember Elder Tess was mentioning in one of her studies that all our problems is the breaking down of the marriage in Eden. And we could see that it's the same structure. Even a nation who doesn't even believe in God, they still hold on to the structure of patriarchy, that if you submit under the rule of that person, then peaceful and harmony will be within the community. But if you don't, then things gonna get nasty. So we can still see that even in a country who live by a philosophy, not by a Christian belief. That what she said.
It's not even religion. It's a philosophy. They're
Yeah.
communists. They're not religious. Where did it come from? Tower of Babel, really. Yeah. But it's so ingrained that even when they don't like the government policy, still patriarchy rules. Still, it's the girls that will be killed. Just reading about this has been, I'm giving you a summary, but journalists, they were in China. One in particular, she saw the mother with the baby as soon as it was born, and the grandmother came and snatched the baby and threw it in a slop bucket until it drowned in the slop. She tried to save the baby. And they're explaining to her, no, this is the best thing. This girl does not want to live. If this girl lives, and they list all the things that happen to this girl if she lives, and what would happen to the family. And these things just stay with the journalists forever. You don't forget something like that. But, and then when there's money to be made. So people will do anything for economic prosperity. If the government doesn't give it to you, then you find other ways, and black markets thrive.
You can see a whole lot of structure of evil created on that, policy alone.
Yes.
Elder Terrie, when you were talking about the endless purge, I was wondering if, and you're talking about how it's that sort of continuous re-education, I was thinking of and wondering if we could make the comparison to what you mentioned earlier, Elder Parminder, I think about a week ago, talking about that continuous mindset of repentance in a sort of real distorted form, obviously, but similar sort of logic with towing the party line, that continuous re-education and rethinking.
Oh, you like forced obedience? Are you saying it's like a counterfeit? Or?
Yeah. Obviously, we don't force people into it. The party was, but yeah, sort of coercive, continuous repentance and re-education process.
Well, what I find really interesting is that Mao Zedong actually said that women hold up half the sky during the revolution, because they had women parties. Women were really involved in that revolution. They worked hard amongst the villages, getting the information, the propaganda to people, getting people on board. They worked in the Russian Revolution too. There were a lot of women involved in rising up. But then as soon as it all gets settled and you've got government in control, then women are put back in their box. And the women's societies, the name escapes me, I should look it up for next time, excuse me, that were involved in the Chinese Revolution, they still exist. But today it is to try and get women to toe the party line. So they are encouraging girls to wear your makeup, look pretty, Don't worry about education. Find a good man, settle down, obey the system. So that's what these women groups, or the major women group is doing today. So where you saw women in actually high roles with the revolution, that all went until, was it last year or the year before? We'll look at that when we get to it. All women were taken from the Politburo. They have no role in government at all anymore. The ones that used to were only wives of officials anyway. I shouldn't say only. They were, probably still had a right to be there, but they were connected. They had connections. So today, if you want a job, if you're a woman and you want a job, you look at the advertisements in China and it'll say men only, or it'll say men only and only pretty women need apply. You can't get away with that here. Such is the discrimination. The gender pay gap in China just grew. And I'm kind of jumping ahead of myself because the economy starts to grow, but it didn't help women at all. Such was the control of patriarchy in their culture that things only got worse. And today we're not seeing the infanticide. We're not the orphanages aren't as full, of course, but it's with the Me Too movement and it's just if not more sexist and misogynist. They're very hard to be female and to achieve anything outside of the standard family. Thank you, Ray. Sorry, I probably went off topic there.
No, not at all.
Terrie,
Good.
Elder Terrie, you were talking about here Chinese government, political leaders, but if we bring that down, it comes all the way to the family. I remember too, and some of the ones that are asking the women to submit are women themselves in high positions. And I mentioned two doctors that I know very well, well known within Adventism. The senior one said to the younger one, because a marriage was breaking down, submit. And she says, but I'm submitting. No, submit. And then here's another parent saying to the daughter, the trouble is you, even though he's bashing her, going unconscious. The trouble is you are not submitting. So it comes all the way from government right down to the household, all the way down women.
So this is something the Chinese government understand really, really well. That's why they push it, that it has to be right at a family level. You get the core of the family right, that will grow and we will create a prosperous country. So that's what they really push. So there's three things that the Chinese government are afraid of and are fighting against internally. One is poverty. They promise their people economic prosperity. That's part of the bargain. You shut up, you obey, we'll make sure your standard of living rises. So they fear economic downturn. Minorities, which we'll get into when we've already started with Tibet, the Tibetans. There's the Uyghurs and the Kazakhs and a lot of others. They're the big name ones. But, the size of China, it's the size of Europe, right? So even the Chinese government recognizes 37 different types of ethnic groups across China. So, and that's their figures. So they fear ethnic minorities. The other third thing they fear are feminists. They have to squash any feminist activity because that will affect the family and it will affect society and it will affect government and they will lose power and control. And it's all about keeping power and control. So hopefully that will become clearer as we go through.
Terrie,
thank you, Joseph.
you sound like
Yes,
that, you
Laurie.
know, the policy of prosperity is depend on how they treat women, is it?
You know, it kind of is, because you know what, they've got an aging population. They need labor. They need a workforce. And the majority of their population is female, and they're keeping them out of the workforce. It doesn't make any economic sense. They're not paying them enough. They're not paying them enough to even want to get into some of these jobs. It really doesn't. It really is poor management. When they should be taking advantage. That's what countries do in times of war, isn't it? The men get shipped off to war. Who's going to run the factories? Who's going to grow the crops? The women get in and do it. You know, quite capable. So I mean, it happens. They're in that situation now where they do not have enough labor. And the labor that's staring them right in the face, can't use them because they're women. So I can't explain that. You know, you just got to shake your head. So countries going down because these policies, this management, which is basic human rights abuse.
Just a thought, Elder Terrie.
Yes.
Since you're talking about it, even though women are there, they don't want to use them. It's just a thought. It shows how much they want to keep on to their culture, yeah, and how much they value that patriarchy. Yeah, they do not want women to rise up.
No. That is one of their three fears. Is it a prophetic consequence? Sorry, Greg, I'm not sure what you mean by that question. But
basically,
we'll think about.
when God pronounced a consequence of the actions of sin, he wasn't saying, I'm going to curse you because of this. It was a consequence of their sin that, you know, the situations occurred. So I mean it in that context. It's a consequence of their own sin and actions that now they're reaping, you know, in that context.
Yeah. They had a prophet. He was an economist. He went 1, 2, 4. And if you do 1, 2, 4, this is what's going to happen after so many generations. They rejected the prophet. So they're wearing the consequences. Yeah, we bring these things on ourselves. So where are we up to? We just did, we're not getting far. Okay. So 1991 adoptions. So I just didn't want to write adoptions and you go, okay, so now some babies get to go to America. It's much bigger than that. It's much more horrible than that. I mean, there's babies that have found, children that have found good homes, but the heartache behind all that, the corruption behind all that, I think we, should have some insight on. So that brings us to 1996. 1996 is the peak of US hegemony. What's US hegemony? It's where basically they're doing very well. They're running the world. So let's 1996. Okay, big year. There's 3 elections. Russian election, US election, Taiwan election. So the Russian election, Yeltsin is, this is just review this quickly. Yeltsin is not doing well. He's doing very poorly. He needs something to boost his reputation. So he's in trouble in Russia. Clinton, the economy is doing well for him in the US, but the Republicans are saying that he's soft on foreign affairs. So that's how they're needling him. And then we have the first democratic presidential elections for Taiwan. And China are determined that they will not have democratic elections, or that they will not vote in a democratic government. So this is 1996. So what happens is there is a Yeltsin-Jiang summit. Let me bring up the... So 1996, the Yeltsin-Jiang summit, where Yeltsin comes to China. They say it's a watershed year for Russia's ties with China, and it shows the role of domestic politics in driving great power relations. So Yeltsin, he's just been embarrassed because of what's happening in Chechnya. In 1995, America had forced NATO enlargement in Europe. So the Russians aren't happy about that. And Yeltsin pretty much let it happen, didn't do anything about it. And so the people see him as a pretty weak president. Nobody thinks he's got any chance of winning. He comes to China, they have this summit, and he goes home promoting a new era in Sino-Russian relations. And the treaty that comes out of that summit, it's pretty much responsible for coasting him to re-election a couple of months later. They declared the summit an equal, trusting partnership aimed at strategic cooperation in the 21st century. And the quote here says, "The Sino-Russian challenge to the unipolar world had begun." So this is where they mark the relationship between China and Russia being a challenge to the United States hegemony, or a unipolar world, a world that is pretty much run by the United States. Now, we've got this election in Taiwan, and the United States Clinton is seen as soft on foreign policy. So when China tries to scare the Taiwanese government and the Taiwanese people into not voting for democracy by they ran a series of missile tests in the waters surrounding Taiwan, including the Taiwan Strait. And they wanted to send a strong signal to the Republic of China. And what the Americans did was they sent their fleet It was the largest display of US power in Asia since the Vietnam War. They sent the carrier Group 7, led by the USS Nimitz, through the Taiwan Straits. And then they also entered into a security alliance with Japan. And Taiwan went ahead with their elections and voted in a democratic president. So this is 1996. Document 7 that I've listed here we'll come back to. We'll go on and look in 2001. The world, 2001. So 1996 is a really important year for all three countries. In 2001, China joins the World Trade Organization. And I just want to, I've got a document here I might share. No, not that one. I'll read this paragraph. The world hoped that here, 2001, joining the World Trade Organization, China would become more democratic and open. It would develop a middle class and a democracy. A democracy would naturally follow, but that didn't happen. The purge never stopped, regardless of wealth. Quoting from a Vox article, despite some apprehension, China's accession to the World Trade Organization in 2001 was hailed as a magnificent achievement that would stay in history as the indelible etching on the wall, commemorating the definitive victory of the liberal paradigm. But 20 years later, the mood has changed radically. So what they're saying was this was meant to be a momentous occasion for good. It had joined the World Trade Organization. This would be commemorated forever as a change for China, but it didn't happen. And I had another quote on that, but I can't find it. No, I'm sure I had. We might have to come back to that. Okay, so that's 2001. China joins the World Trade Organization. They've been out. Well, I explained that in the last one, so I won't repeat. They also sign a treaty with the Federation of Russia, and it's called the Treaty of Good Neighborliness and Friendly Cooperation. Start again. The Treaty of Good Neighborliness and Friendly Cooperation between the People's Republic of China and the Russian Federation. There's a reason I didn't write it on the board. This was another milestone. And in 2004, I've marked 2004 there, but I haven't written anything. This is where they clear up all the border disputes. So the border disputes that we marked in 1969 are all cleared up by 2001 and 2004 with these treaties. 2001, of course, we know for September 11. So September 11, since the September 11 attacks in 2001, the Chinese government began to label violence in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region as terrorism. So let's just familiarize ourselves. So here's a map of China, and you can see the Russian border here. It's really hard to get a grasp of size here. We talked about border conflicts between China and Russia. See the border that runs along here? That's over 4,300 kilometers long. So that's bigger than Sydney to Perth or Melbourne to the Cape York Peninsula. Much longer, that border. When we look at Xinjiang province, that's slightly bigger than the Northern Territory, a bit smaller than Queensland, but it's got 18 million people in it. So, here's Tibet here. But, you know, Australia's what, got 25 million? There's 18 million in this province here, which is the size, yeah, marginally smaller than Queensland. So very long borders with Russia and a very large province over here. Yeah, here's another map just showing a border with Russia. It really depends on how the map is drawn or laid out to get some sort of idea of the length of these borders and the size. So when we talk about the Uyghurs, this is Xinjiang province, and it also was taken by the People's Republic of China in 1959, same time as Tibet, when they expanded their territories. They had been autonomous or just kind of linked in with these other countries, Kazakhstan. Yeah, they're seen as an East Asian, a Central East Asian country, but then they were overtaken, controlled by China with the revolution. And they are largely Muslim. So the Uyghurs are a Turkic ethnic group originating from and culturally affiliated with the general region of Central and East Asia. Mostly Muslim. In the 1980s, Chinese authorities relaxed some of its repressive policies against ethnic minorities and loosened border controls, which allowed Uyghurs to travel to the Mecca pilgrimage. During this period, some Uyghurs came into contact with radical Islamist groups operating in Central Asia and Pakistan, while others were studied in Quranic schools associated with Islamist movements. So they loosened their policies and they allowed the Uyghurs out to travel. And of course, they went on pilgrimage. And now the fear is that on those pilgrimage, that they've all become radicalized. So why does China fear these minority groups? And it's because of what happened in 1989. And I should say 1991. In 1991, with the dissolving of the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union was similar in that it was a mini, you know, the size of another Europe. It had many different cultures and countries, or we call satellite states. And after 1989, these particular countries became more nationalistic and broke away from the Soviet Union. And this is what China fears will happen with its minorities. It's determined that what happened in 1991 will not happen for China. So it oppressively controls all the minority groups to make sure that history doesn't get repeated. So in 2001, the Twin Towers in New York City are brought down by Islamist extremists, and China is now going to say, oh, we feel so bad, we're so sorry for you, United States. We know exactly how you feel. We have our own terrorists right here in our backyard. And they start to use September 11 as an excuse to control the Muslim minorities in their country. And I'll just bring up a... Oh. This is Human Rights Watch backgrounder. This is a human rights news document. And we'll just read a couple of paragraphs from it. In the wake of the September 11 attacks on the United States, the People's Republic of China has offered strong support for Washington, and affirmed that it opposes terrorism on any form and supports actions to combat terrorism. Human Rights Watch is concerned that China's support for the war against terrorism will be a pretext for gaining international support, or at least silence, for its own crackdown on ethnic Uyghurs in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. So this is written in 2001. They know what China is trying to do. Beijing has long claimed to be confronted with religious extremist forces and violent terrorists in Xinjiang, a vast region 1/6 of China's land area, home to 18 million. Much like Tibetans, the Uyghurs in Xinjiang have struggled for cultural survival in the face of a government-supported influx by Chinese migrants. So they're sending in their own Han people to try and get the Uyghurs and the minorities to blend in more with what they consider normal Chinese culture. It says here, Chinese authorities have not discriminated between peaceful and violent dissent. So there has been demonstrations, there were riots, but they're very, very few and far between. So when China is talking about terrorism, it's talking about peace. Most of what they're talking about is peaceful complaints, peaceful demonstrations, but they lump it all under the one umbrella of terrorism. For time, I'm just going to go to the conclusion. The genuine security problem that exists in Xinjiang is being manipulated by Chinese authorities for political ends. When it is expedient, for example, when trying to attract foreign investment for the multi-million Xinjiang-Shanghai pipeline, the authorities insist that only an extremely small number of elements are engaged in separatism and that the situation is stable. On September 2, for instance, the Xinjiang Autonomous Region chairman told the Hong Kong newspaper that by no means is Xinjiang a place where violence and terrorist accidents take place very often. But on the other hand, when it desires international support for its crackdown on Uyghur challenges to Chinese authority, including peaceful activities, the government raises the spectre of Islamic terrorism. China has clear responsibilities under international law to respect the fundamental right of the Uyghur population, all the more so because it is now a signatory to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So the Chinese are a member of the United Nations. They give lip service to universal human rights, but they say that it has to be, it depends. So they don't really believe in universal human rights. Human rights are dependent on whether just try and find my notes. Oh yes, so they say it depends on the natural conditions of the country, the economic development of a country, and the religious historical context of that country. So universal human rights are conditional. They are contingent on whether the country is economically developed, on what its religious history has been, and and the natural conditions of that country. So they are now going to begin an oppressive oppression of the Uyghurs, and this is marked from 2001. We will look into this more, especially in 2014, when we look at Xi Jinping, because he's going to ramp it up and take the oppression of these minorities to a whole new level. And we'll be able to take that back and mark it in 1996, because it's in 1996 that they laid their plans to oppress these minorities. But what gave them the legitimacy to do it was September 11. They're going to use September 11 as an excuse to further their own designs on these people. So we've gone long enough today, didn't get as far as I thought. Next time we won't do as much review. But I think so far you can see that their relationships with Russia has ebbed and flowed. They were enemies up until the time of the end, and now they are developing stronger and stronger ties with Russia. At the same time, the United States, they have a relationship with them that is based on the economy, but it is also tentative because of what is happening in Taiwan. And then we also see its human rights violations with Tibet, with the Uyghurs, with women, with the one-child policy, and how we will see how that all ties together as we continue through the history. So we will close with a prayer. Dear God in heaven, sometimes it is so overwhelming to see, to read, to learn about man's inhumanity to man, how we treat each other and consider others. Lord, we know that the extreme form of that is seen in misogyny and sexism. Help us to make the connections, to bring it down into our own life. As we recognize state terrorism, may we be abhorrent, see the abhorrence of it, and also of what happens in the home and on a local level. So we thank you for this morning. We pray for the remainder of the Sabbath, the studies that are yet to be done. May you bless the people that are leading out, and bless each member as they continue to keep your Sabbath holy. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.